Dagmar will introduce.
So Fred Danion, again, like Madhu, I have known forever, since he was a postdoc at Penn State and worked at the time on multi-finger coordination with Marc Latache. He then moved back to France and is now what's it called, research scientist at the CNRS in Aix and or Marseille. And he has switched and expanded his research agenda to also look at eye-hand coordination, multi-finger coordination, also in the manipulation context of non-rigid objects. And so I am curious what he has to say today to us. So thank you, Fred. Please get started.
Thank you, Dagmar, for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm really glad to be there. So today I'm going to talk about manual tracking under challenging and cursor mapping. For those of you that are not familiar, oops, sorry, looks like it didn't work.
We can see your slide fine.
You see the next slide or not?
No.
Yeah, for me it's also...
It's frozen. You can get out of PowerPoint and then start again.
Okay, do you see it now?
No.
We can see your cursor, but only the title slide.
Okay, so I'll come back to this one. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry about that. It looks like it's working now. So today we'll talk about the adaptation of manual tracking to challenging and cursor mapping. And for those of you that are not familiar with manual tracking, I will simply tell them that this task consists in keeping the hand or a cursor as close as possible from a moving target. And you can use a mouse or joystick to perform this task. And why people are interested in manual tracking in motor control? Well, I believe first, this is a good proxy for object manipulation. And importantly, this is also a good proxy for feedback control. In many of studies in motor control, people are focusing on reaching movements, but those movements, those reaching movements, put the emphasis on feed-forward control. And here, when you have to track a moving target that possibly follows an unpredictable trajectory, you definitely have to rely on feedback control. I also believe that manual tracking is also a good proxy for eye-hand coordination. When, of course, you record eye movement during this task, you can then investigate if gaze is on the cursor or the target, especially during complex cursor target mapping. And importantly here, I also believe that manual tracking is also a good proxy for sensory motor adaptation. As soon as you change the input-output properties of the joystick or the mouse that you're using for tracking, you definitely elicit some sensory motor adaptation. So how do we study manual tracking in our lab? Well, we typically put the subject in front of a screen, and on the table in front of him, there is a joystick. And when the person is looking at the screen, this person can see two dots, a red dot that represents the cursor that is moved by the joystick, and a target that moves along a complex trajectory. We have many of them. And those trajectory results from the combination of several sinusoids along the horizontal and the vertical axis. And just to give you a flavor about this tracking task, I show you here a typical trial in which the subject is trying to bring the red cursor as close as possible from the blue one. Okay, and to assess tracking performance in this task, we typically average the distance between the cursor and the target over the whole trial. The distance is generally on the order of 1 or 2 centimeters. So today I will present two experiments. The first one relates to the optimality of bimanual tracking, and a paper was recently published in the Journal of Neurophysiology. The second study that I will present refers to the adaptation and modularity of unimanual tracking, and this work is still in progress. So now to start with the bimanual experiment, I need first to refer to the optimal control theory that states that every time we make a movement, there is a minimization of effort and or variability. Well, this theory was originally introduced using unimanual hand movements. Well, later on, using bimanual pointing movement, it was shown that those movements could also be accounted by the optimal control theory. The question that we wanted to address with our bimanual tracking study is whether those movements that you perform under bimanual tracking can be accounted by the optimal control theory. So we are subject to perform the following bimanual tracking task, in which they had two joysticks, but only one cursor to control. Okay? And subject would perform this bimanual tracking task under two different mappings. The first one, that was inspired by the work of Didrikson, consisted in averaging the position of the two joysticks. Okay? And we call it the mean mapping. The second mapping consisted in what we call a split mapping, in which each joystick was responsible for the motion of the cursor along the horizontal or the vertical axis. In this case here, the right hand is responsible for the horizontal motion and the left hand for the vertical motion. And we took inspiration from the work of Nelson and Nelson in 2002. However, a key difference with this work is that in our case, the joystick were not restrained to a single axis. Each joystick could move along the two directions. So before we assess the coordination between the right and the left hand during bimanual task, I believe it is important to assess the performance of the right and the left hand during unimanual hand tracking. And here, for a right-handed participant, you have compared the performance of the left hand and the right hand for the same target trajectory. And as you can see, well, as expected, the subject is better with the right hand than the left hand. Okay, this was just a typical trial, but if now you look at the group data, so you'll find again an advantage of the right hand with a smaller cursor target distance in comparison to the left hand. And this difference is on the order of 20%. So really the right hand is definitely more accurate when you do this tracking task in comparison to the left hand. And these results are consistent with previous study that investigated the effect of handedness on manual tracking. So now in the context of the optimal control theory, if we assume that there is a minimization of variability, under the mean mapping, we expect a larger contribution of the right dominant hand that is less noisy than the left hand. Now, with regard to the split mapping, if we assume that there is a minimization of effort, we assume that movements that do not contribute to cursor motion should be scarce. However, one issue is that this optimal control theory did not really pay attention to the fact that we have a natural tendency to perform similar hand movement in space, as originally shown by Kelso and colleagues in 1979. So now if we assume that this strong tendency to perform similar hand movement in space is stronger than the minimization of variability and effort, we may actually different hypothesis such that you would get an equal contribution of the two hands under the mean mapping and a persistence of hand movements that do not contribute to cursor motion under the split mapping. Now let's see the results. So here you get a typical trial performed under the mean mapping. And as you can see, the subject is doing a reasonable job. But what is of interest in this trial is what are doing each individual hand. what you can see in this trial is that the movement of the right and the left hand in dotted line are very similar in space. And the data across all subjects, you'll find that you always get a very high correlation between the movement of the right and the left hand. Those movements are typically synchronous. And importantly here, for our hypothesis, is that the total distance covered by the right and the left hand are similar. So there is no greater involvement of the right hand. Of course, I now need to tell you that all these studies were conducted on right-handed subjects. Now, let's take a look at the bimanual split mapping. So in this trial, the right hand was responsible for the horizontal motion and the left hand for the vertical motion. Again, the subject is doing a reasonable tracking performance. However, now if you look at the movement of the hand along the non-relevant axis, you'll see again that participants are making very similar hand movement in space. Again, very high correlation between the two hands. Those movements are very synchronized. And very importantly for our hypothesis, we found that the total distance covered for relevant and irrelevant movement were the same. So we conclude from that study that hand coordination in space during bimanual overrules the minimization of variability and effort. Let me now switch to the second part of my talk, in which the focus was on the modularity of unimanual tracking. And by modularity, I refer to the ability to combine and decompose skills or adaptation. Well, modularity can be tested in using different protocols. The first one consists in a composition protocol in which people are asked to learn first a task A, then a task B, and are subsequently tested over a combined task that results from the combination of task A and task B. You can also test modularity through a decomposition protocol in which people are first required to learn the combined task and are subsequently tested for task A and task B. Well, modularity has been shown by Flanagan and colleagues almost 20 years ago in a set of tasks that used a force field and a visuomotor rotation task. So in both cases, modularity was fine between the force field and the visuomotor rotation, but the issue is that maybe this thing was possible because the force field and the visuomotor rotation adaptation relied on separate sensory modality. Namely, force field was more in relation to proprioception and visuomotor rotation was more in relation to vision. Well, we challenged this modularity by looking at the context of two visuomotor mappings that presumably compete for resources in memory. And if this is the case, we actually expect a lower modularity of adaptation in the context of two visuomotor mappings. That's not exactly what we got. And here first are the two visuomotor mapping that we employed. First, a rotated mapping in which the hand movement, the cursor joystick, the joystick movement were biased by 90 degrees on the screen. And when you are asked to perform for the first time this tracking task with such perturbation, as shown here on this video, this task is definitely challenging. So as you can see here, the tracking error is big and subject is simply unable to do a good job. So this is the first visuomotor perturbation that we employed. Then we used another one that I called a spring mapping, in which we mimicked a spring relationship between the joystick and the cursor. And to simulate this dynamic, we used the following differential equation and the following spring parameters. Importantly here, there was no haptic feedback in the joystick. So this is really just a visual spring. And if you see again the performance of naive subjects when they use this spring mapping, obviously tracking performance is really bad. But ultimately, with more and more trials, they can reduce the tracking error. And now that I've presented the spring mapping and the rotation mapping, we used a combined mapping by adding the rotated and the spring mapping, making the task possibly even more challenging now. And again, as you can see in this video, people really struggle bringing the cursor on the target. So you can actually wonder, can people learn this combined mapping? The answer is yes. So here you get the learning curve of naive subjects that need to get any prior experience with the joystick. And as you can see, after 50 trials, tracking error is substantially reduced by almost 50%. So now we may ask, okay, what about the composition effect? So now if people got previous experience with the task A and the task B, do they actually have an advantage now for the combined task? And this is what we show here. When people got prior experience with the rotation and the spring mapping separately, they have a benefit to handle the combined mapping. So definitely the answer is yes, there is a composition effect with our two visual motor mapping. Now let us address the decomposition effect. So in this case, we ask the question, do people that learn the combined task first have an advantage to now perform the task A and the task B? So here I present the data regarding naive subject that learned for the very first time the rotation. And as you can see, again, people are able to learn the rotation. And now the question is, do people that got prior experience with the combined task exhibit smaller tracking error? And the answer is yes. People that got exposure to the combined task are actually able to provide better performance on the rotation task. Now let's have a look now on the spring mapping condition. So again, here we have naive participant that absolutely got no prior experience. And you'll see that again, we have a similar advantage provided by prior experience on the combined task. So altogether, we'll see that prior experience with the combined mapping does provide some benefit to handle each mapping separately. But composition and decomposition effective with the two visual motor mapping. So what have we learned from the two studies? Well, I believe first that we demonstrated that bimanual tracking is not optimal in the sense of optimal control theory, because hand coordination in space seems to matter most than minimizing effort and variability. Now, regarding the second study, we have shown that people can learn complex visual motor mappings while being able to decompose and compose them to satisfy task demands. Finally, I hope I convince you that manual tracking is a simple yet powerful task to explore sensory motor processes. And before I finish this talk, I would like to thank my closest collaborators on this project, namely James Matthew, who was my former PhD student, as well as Aymar de Rugy from Bordeaux University and Pierre-Michel Bernier from Sherbrooke University. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fred.